The moon hung like a pale lantern above Edo Castle, casting silver shadows through the blooming sakura trees that lined the ceremonial gardens. It was the height of Hanami season in the year 1642, during the reign of Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu, when the rigid social order of feudal Japan demanded absolute loyalty, unwavering duty, and unquestioned honor from every soul within the realm. I am Akiko, daughter of a minor daimyo from Kai Province, wife to Takashi Matsudaira, a samurai of considerable standing within the Tokugawa administration. Our marriage had been arranged when I was merely 16, a political alliance designed to strengthen my father's tenuous position within the complex web of feudal obligations that governed our world. 3 years had passed since that ceremony, 3 years during which I had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of samurai society, where a single misstep could bring disgrace not only upon oneself but upon one's entire family line stretching back generations. The cherry blossom festival of that fateful spring would forever remain etched in my memory, not for its beauty or the joy it traditionally brought to the people of Edo, but for the moment when my carefully constructed world began to crumble like autumn leaves beneath the weight of an impossible truth. Takashi had left our modest residence in the samurai quarter that evening, dressed in his finest silk hakama and haori, the Matsudaira family crest embroidered in gold thread upon his shoulders. He claimed urgent business at the castle, a meeting with his superior regarding the ongoing Christian persecution that had intensified under the Sakoku isolation policy. As his wife, I was expected to accept his word without question, to tend to our household duties while he fulfilled his obligations to our lord and, by extension, to the shogun himself. Yet something in his manner that evening had troubled me deeply. Perhaps it was the way his eyes avoided mine as he secured his katana and wakizashi at his side, or the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from his normally composed demeanor. Takashi was a man who prided himself on emotional restraint, who had mastered the art of maintaining his stoic facade even in the most trying circumstances. To see him display even the slightest hint of inner turmoil was as unusual as witnessing Mount Fuji shed its snow in winter. Unable to shake my growing unease, I made a decision that would have horrified any proper samurai wife. I would follow him. Wrapping myself in a dark kosode and arranging my hair beneath a simple tenugui cloth, I set out into the lantern-lit streets of Edo. The city thrummed with festival energy as families gathered beneath the cherry trees, sharing sake and composing poetry in celebration of the fleeting beauty of the blossoms. Merchants hawked their wares from temporary stalls, while geishas moved gracefully through the crowds, their elaborate kimonos creating moving works of art against the backdrop of pink and white petals that drifted like snow through the warm spring air. Following Takashi through the winding streets required all the stealth I could muster. The samurai quarter was laid out according to strict hierarchical principles, with the most prestigious families residing closest to the castle grounds. Our own dwelling occupied a respectable position, reflecting Takashi's steady rise through the administrative ranks, but it was far from the grand estates of the Hatamoto who served directly under the shogun. As we moved through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, I began to realize that Takashi was not, in fact, heading toward the castle. Instead, his path led toward the pleasure quarters that had sprung up around the edges of the city, areas that existed in a strange liminal space within the rigid social structure of Edo society. Here, the normal rules were bent if not entirely suspended, creating a world where samurai, merchants, and artisans might find themselves sharing the same tea house or bathhouse, united in their pursuit of earthly pleasures that were officially discouraged by the Confucian moral code that governed daily life. The deeper we ventured into this twilight world, the more my apprehension grew. What business could my husband possibly have in such a place? The Matsudaira family had always prided itself on moral rectitude, and Takashi himself had often spoken disparagingly of samurai who frequented the pleasure quarters, viewing such behavior as beneath the dignity of the warrior class. My pursuit led me through narrow alleyways where red lanterns cast their warm glow upon wooden buildings that seemed to lean inward conspiratorially. The air was thick with the scent of incense, cooking food and something else, an undercurrent of secrecy that made my skin prickle with nervous anticipation. Musicians played shamisen in hidden courtyards, while the laughter of women echoed from behind sliding screens decorated with elaborate paintings of cranes and bamboo forests. Finally, Takashi stopped before an unremarkable building whose only distinguishing feature was a small sign bearing the image of a chrysanthemum. He paused at the entrance, glancing around nervously before disappearing through a curtained doorway. My heart pounded as I crept closer, positioning myself behind a wooden cart where I could observe without being detected. What I witnessed next would haunt me for the remainder of my days. Through a gap in the building's wooden shutters, I could see into a modest room lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows upon the walls. Takashi sat upon tatami mats, but he was not alone. Across from him knelt a woman whose beauty was so striking that it seemed to illuminate the very air around her. Her hair was arranged in the elaborate style of a high-ranking courtesan, secured with ornate combs that caught the lamplight like captured stars. Her kimono was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, decorated with patterns of flowing water and golden koi that seemed to swim across the silk fabric. But it was not her beauty that froze my blood in my veins. It was the sight of Takashi reaching across the low table between them and gently taking her hand in his own. In that moment, the carefully ordered world I had known shattered like a dropped ceramic bowl. Here was my husband, a man who had sworn before the gods to honor me as his wife, holding hands with another woman in circumstances that could only suggest the deepest intimacy. The betrayal cut through me like a blade forged by a master swordsmith, sharp and clean and devastating in its precision. I wanted to burst through those screens, to confront them both and demand explanations that might somehow restore order to my universe. I wanted to rage and weep and call down the vengeance of the kami upon them both. But I remained frozen, hidden behind that cart like a common spy, unable to move or breathe or think beyond the single terrible truth that now dominated my existence. My husband was unfaithful. Yet even as I struggled to process this revelation, something in their interaction struck me as strange. There was an urgency to their conversation, a tension that seemed at odds with a romantic rendezvous. The woman appeared to be pleading with Takashi about something, her normally composed features animated by what looked like fear or desperation. And Takashi himself seemed torn, his free hand clenched into a fist as he listened to whatever she was telling him. Straining to hear their words above the distant sounds of the festival, I caught only fragments of their conversation. The woman spoke of danger, of discovery, of needing to flee the city before dawn. Takashi's responses were too quiet to make out clearly, but his body language suggested internal conflict, as if he were being asked to make an impossible choice between competing loyalties. Then, without warning, the woman stood and moved toward the room's single window. As she passed directly in front of the gap through which I had been observing, the lamplight fell fully upon her face, and I gasped in recognition. She was Lady Mariko Hosokawa, daughter of a Christian daimyo who had been executed the previous year for his refusal to renounce his foreign faith. According to official records, she had died alongside her father, a victim of the Tokugawa regime's increasingly harsh persecution of Christianity. Yet here she stood, very much alive, in a secret meeting with my husband. The implications of this discovery struck me like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. If Lady Mariko was alive, if she had somehow escaped the execution that was supposed to have claimed her life, then she was now among the most hunted fugitives in all of Japan. The Christian rebellion in Shimabara had ended in devastating defeat just 5 years earlier, and the shogunate's paranoia about foreign influence had reached fever pitch. To harbor or assist a known Christian, especially one from such a prominent family, would be tantamount to treason. And my husband, my loyal, honorable, duty-bound husband, was holding her hand. As I crouched in the shadows, struggling to make sense of what I was witnessing, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Takashi's recent absences, his distracted behavior, his obvious anxiety that evening. It all pointed to involvement in something far more dangerous than a simple romantic affair. He was risking not only his own life but the honor and safety of his entire family to protect this woman. But why? The answer came as Lady Mariko returned to her seat and resumed their intense conversation. Even from my limited vantage point, I could see tears glistening on her cheeks as she spoke. Takashi leaned forward, his usual stoic demeanor completely abandoned as he listened to whatever desperate tale she was sharing. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, his head bowed as if in prayer or deep contemplation. Finally he spoke, and though I could not make out his exact words, his tone conveyed a gravity that made my heart race. Whatever he was promising her, it was clearly a commitment that would cost him dearly. Lady Mariko's relief was visible even from my hiding place as she pressed his hand between both of hers, her gratitude transforming her beautiful features into something almost radiant. It was then that I understood the true nature of what I was witnessing. This was not a betrayal of our marriage in the conventional sense. This was something far more complex and dangerous, an act of compassion that defied the rigid social order that governed our world. Takashi was risking everything to save a woman whose only crime had been her loyalty to a faith that the authorities had declared anathema. The realization should have brought me relief, but instead it filled me with a new kind of terror. If Takashi were discovered helping Lady Mariko, the consequences would extend far beyond his own death. Our families would be destroyed, their honor forever tainted by association with his treasonous actions. Even distant relatives would find themselves ostracized from polite society, their children unable to marry within their social class, their economic prospects ruined by the scandal. As I watched them prepare to part, Lady Mariko bowing deeply in gratitude while Takashi secured a small bundle that he pressed into her hands, I found myself faced with an impossible choice. I could expose them both, fulfilling my duty as a loyal subject of the shogun and protecting my family from the devastating consequences of Takashi's compassion. Or I could remain silent, becoming complicit in their dangerous game while knowing that discovery meant certain death for us all. The weight of this decision pressed down upon me like the stone lanterns that marked the pathways through temple gardens. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of the cherry blossom festival continuing, families laughing and wife preparing meals, tending to household duties, maintaining the garden. But my mind was elsewhere, following Takashi and his dangerous charge as they made their way through the countryside beyond Edo. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every visitor to our neighborhood filled me with terror that the authorities had come to arrest me for my role in the night's activities. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, I heard familiar footsteps approaching our door. Takashi entered quietly, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had not slept, but also the relief of someone who had seen a difficult task through to completion. "It is done," he said simply. "She is safe." The weight that lifted from my shoulders at those words was almost physical in its intensity. We had succeeded. Against all odds, despite the incredible risks, we had managed to save a life and preserve the network that might save others in the future. But even as we embraced, both of us trembling with relief and delayed shock at what we had accomplished, we knew that our lives had been forever changed by the events of this night. We were no longer the simple, obedient subjects of the Tokugawa regime we had been the previous evening. We had chosen to follow a higher law, one that valued mercy and compassion over blind obedience to authority. In the days and weeks that followed, we settled back into the routine of our normal lives, but both of us carried the secret knowledge of what we had done. It was a burden and a source of strength, a reminder that even in a world where conformity was demanded and dissent was punished by death, individuals could still choose to act with courage and compassion. The Cherry Blossom Festival of 1642 would be remembered by most people as just another celebration of spring's arrival, a time of beauty and joy that provided a brief respite from the serious business of daily life. But for us, it marked the beginning of a different kind of existence, one in which we had learned that sometimes the most honorable choice is the one that defies honor itself. Years later, as the Tokugawa regime's grip on Japan tightened even further and the persecution of Christians reached new heights of brutality, I would often think back to that night and wonder about the fate of Lady Mariko Hosokawa. Did she make it safely to the hidden communities in the north? Was she able to live out her days in peace, surrounded by others who shared her forbidden faith? Or did she eventually fall victim to the relentless hunt for Christian survivors? I never learned the answers to these questions, and perhaps it was better that way. What mattered was not the ultimate outcome of her flight but the choice we had made to help her. In a world that demanded conformity above all else, we had chosen compassion. In a society that valued obedience over individual conscience, we had followed our hearts rather than our orders. The cherry blossoms that night had bloomed and fallen as they always did, their beauty made more poignant by its brief duration. But the choices we made beneath those blossoms, the decision to value human life over political loyalty, to show mercy to an enemy, to risk everything for a principle we could barely articulate, those choices would last forever. And perhaps that is the true lesson of that long-ago spring night in Edo. The world may demand that we choose between competing loyalties, may force us to decide between safety and conscience, between conformity and compassion. But in the end, we are defined not by the choices we are given but by the choices we make when everything we value hangs in the balance. On the night of the Cherry Blossom Festival, I saw my samurai husband holding another woman's hand. His next move, and mine, would teach us both that sometimes the greatest honor lies in defying everything we have been taught to honor. The sakura petals continued to fall long after that night, covering the ground with their pale pink reminder that all beauty is temporary, all power is fleeting, and all we can truly control is the courage we show when faced with impossible choices. In the end, that may be the only honor that